It says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. That's right there in the U.S. Constitution, in the very First Amendment. Pretty clear on the face of it, isn't it? But it's not as cut and dried as it might appear. Some constitutional scholars, including our guest tonight, argue that some religious elements, including the Ten Commandments, actually belong in the nation's classrooms because of their historical and educational value. I want you to meet a warrior in this constitutional battle. For 30 years, Tim Barton has advanced Christian principles through his Texas think tank, Wallbuilders. Tim, great to have you back on the show. Welcome, and Merry Christmas as we get started.
Well, Merry Christmas, Governor. So good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Let's start with Wallbuilders. A lot of our viewers may not know, but let's talk about how did Wallbuilders come to be? What's the mission of the organization?
Yes, sir. Well, Wallbuilders is a faith-based nonprofit, primarily educational, and we take our name from the Bible story of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, for those that remember, was part of the group that was of Israel that was captured in the Babylonian captivity. He was the cupbearer to the king, but he looked back and saw Jerusalem had been destroyed. His heart was so grieved. He wanted to go back and rebuild his home, and he led the effort to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And our name comes from the verse in Nehemiah 2:17, where he said, "Come, let us rebuild the walls that we may no longer be a reproach." And when my dad started Wallbuilders back in the 1980s, it really was a burden that God put on his heart. That if you look at America, even in the 80s, it was so evident that the religious, the moral, the constitutional foundation of the nation was under attack. And he felt God put that burden on his heart to help rebuild the nation. And we do that primarily through helping reintroduce people to the true history of our nation, which is primarily founded on the biblical Judeo-Christian perspective. And then we use original artifacts to help reintroduce people to that truth. We have the largest private collection of original documents from early American history, with tens of thousands of original documents from the actual founding fathers. And so that's part of our initiative and goal and what we do.
Let's jump into that you said a moment ago about that our nation founded on Judeo-Christian principles. There are a lot of modern people today, well-educated people, who say,
Right.
oh, no, we are a very secular society. America was not a religious country, wasn't founded that way. It was founded to be secular. And there's a great argument about that. So set us straight. Was America founded on Judeo-Christian principles or not?
Absolutely, we were. And there's only a debate among academics who largely are referencing modern writings of the founding fathers. It's really not debatable if you go back and study actual history, because, for example, the very first time the founding fathers ever got together, when they met, the First Continental Congress was September 6, 1774. And there's actually records from their very first meeting. And part of the records you can read, you can find them online, is the very first thing that Congress did. The first motion they made in Congress was made by Thomas Cushing in Massachusetts. And the opening motion was that they should open with prayer. They discussed it, they agreed to it, and they agreed they should bring in the local pastor, the Reverend Jacob Duché, to lead them in prayer. The local pastor came, and the records of Congress indicate when they actually had that opening prayer, it lasted for nearly 2 hours. And in the midst of their prayer meeting, they actually studied 4 chapters of the Bible. This is their first move as the founding fathers in Congress. And I mean, Governor, both of us as dedicated believers, we have spent lots of time in prayer. And we know if we were to go to our church and suggest, let's take the next 2 hours and pray, there's a lot of Christians that would be a challenge for them to pray for 2 hours. Well, this isn't like a group of pastors. It wasn't just a group of Christians at church. These were the political leaders of the nation. And I'm giving this only as one indication. There's a lot of things I can point to and reference. In fact, of the 56 men that signed the Declaration, at the time of their signing, 55 of them were members of Orthodox Christian denominations. The vast majority of the founding fathers were outspoken Christians. But today, because we know so little of that history, we don't recognize how much Christianity and the Bible actually influenced the men who shaped our nation. But it's very clear in the historic records.
I know when I got my first job as a teenager, I didn't get a lot of money. I was paid minimum wage working at a little radio station in Arkansas. I guess I wish they'd have paid me in gold. Had they done that, my goodness, it would have been worth a lot today. Well, nobody necessarily pays wages in gold, but the good news is you can actually own gold for yourself, and it's a good investment. It means that you have a hedge against inflation. It's always worth something, always has been. It's why when I buy gold and silver, I rely on the folks at American Hartford Gold. They're the one and only precious metals company that I can recommend, trust, and buy from. If you call or text, you can get a free no strings attached gold and silver information kit from American Hartford Gold. Learn how to protect your nest egg with a tax-advantaged gold IRA. And you could get up to $15,000 of free silver on qualifying purchases. Call them 844-417-1010 or text Mike to 998899 for a free information kit from American Hartford Gold. I love the story about the 2-hour prayer because, Tim, I'm just sitting here and agreeing with you that if you went to the average church in America today and somebody prayed for 2 hours, they would never, ever be asked to pray again. I mean, it's almost unheard of. And we're laughing about it, but it's kind of a wonderful story to say that our nation, whether people want to acknowledge it or not, it really was birthed in prayer. Now, that's not something that most Americans, even well-educated ones, have ever heard before. So let's now get into the fact that one of the, major missions of Wallbuilders is to try to say that documents like the Ten Commandments really do belong in American classrooms. There are people who would say, oh, no, they don't belong. We shouldn't have that. It's religious, and we don't want to influence these students and indoctrinate them. So defend the idea. Why should the Ten Commandments be in America's classrooms?
Well, frankly, they were in American classrooms from the time of the Pilgrims, which they're the ones that were responsible for the first purely American hymn or textbook, rather. It was the New England Primer. In the back of the New England Primer was Westminster Shorter Catechism, and this was in the back of every single primer. The first one was printed in 1690. They were used in public schools from 1690 through the early 1900s. I think 1930 in Nebraska was the last state that actually used them in their public schools. But from the Pilgrims all the way forward, the Ten Commandments were part of that educational system. In the back of that New England Primer, there were 43 questions on the Ten Commandments, which is a lot of questions dealing with the Ten Commandments. Well, the Ten Commandments used to be displayed in public schools all over the nation. It wasn't until 1980 that the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case Stone v. Graham, it was a case out of Kentucky, the U.S. Supreme Court said, well, we can't post copies of the Ten Commandments because that's religious and we can't have religion in schools. The Supreme Court at that time upheld it because it was based on what was known as the Lemon test, a Lemon decision from a 1971 court case. But more recently, and of course, Governor, you know, Coach Kennedy, the famous football coach from Bremerton High School up in Washington, who was fired for taking a knee on the 50-yard line after the football game was over. But he was told as part of the public school system, you're not allowed to show your faith where any student can see it. And if you do, you're going to be fired. Of course, he ends up winning that case in 2022. And when he won that case, the Supreme Court said, the only reason you were fired is they had cited that 1971 Lemon case. And that was the reason they justified firing someone for letting students know that you were actually a Christian. Well, the Supreme Court, in giving Coach Kennedy his victory, they overturned the Lemon decision. And in overturning it, it overturned the bad precedent that had been set before. When the Ten Commandments were removed from public schools in 1980, the only thing the Supreme Court cited as evidence of why the Ten Commandments shouldn't be there was the Lemon decision of 1971. Well, the Lemon decision is now overturned, which means the only thing that said Ten Commandments couldn't be there has now been overturned. But not just that. The Ten Commandments were a stable part of education, again, from the Pilgrims up until the 1980s. And this is something actually the founding fathers encouraged. Every student should grow up learning the morals of the Bible and the morals of Jesus, because the founding fathers explained, without a moral and religious people, America cannot function, and our schools should be promoting and teaching moral instruction. And that's what the Ten Commandments are. It's the foundation of all moral law and moral code in the Western Hemisphere. And the idea today that we would tell students, or even say in public school, we shouldn't display Ten Commandments, there's a level of irony when students can be arrested and go to jail for violating the Ten Commandments that we say they're not allowed to see. That seems inconsistent. They should be able to see things like thou shalt not kill and thou shalt not steal. That's the basic foundation of all law in the Western Hemisphere. and it has incredible educational value as well.
Personal safety has become a major concern. So wouldn't it be helpful to have a new and easy way to protect you and your loved ones? Well, one way to stop the threat without having to shoot and possibly kill someone is available. Hello, I'm Mike Huckabee, and I found exactly how to have full protection without lethal force. It looks like a gun, acts like a gun, but it shoots chemical irritants and kinetic rounds, not actual bullets. The name is Byrna, B-Y-R-N-A. Now imagine being able to protect yourself without the legal or moral concerns of carrying an actual firearm. The Byrna is legal in all 50 states. No background checks are required, and it can be shipped directly to your doorstep. Most importantly, it's built to immediately stop an attacker without taking a life. The peace of mind you have is free. It's easy to use and doesn't have the strong recoil that real guns have, and you don't need ear protection either. It's assembled by hand right here in the U.S., fully trusted by law enforcement, and oftentimes it only needs to be shown and not fired to turn an attacker away. Don't wait until something happens. Go to Byrna.com/Huckabee and learn more about this effective alternative to deadly force. 500,000 are out there already, and right now you'll get a special 10% discount too. That's Byrna with a Y, BYRNA.com/Huckabee. And don't feel vulnerable any longer.